Welcome to another episode of Plenty in 20. Today we're going to be talking about holding people accountable when you can't afford to lose them. My name's Simon Tyson, I'll be your facilitator, and we're going to keep this sharp, punchy, we're going to keep it tight, and we'll be done in 20 minutes or less, and you will walk away with practical, applicable steps and strategies that you can use today to improve performance. We're going to start by talking about the two bookends of high performance. Without these two bookends, every other strategy you use will have limited success. So these are non-negotiable, and they're not as complicated as people think. They're things that leaders can apply today to get improved performance. And the first of those bookends is around expectations. It's what we call clarity. Research after research shows that the number one thing that is correlated to high performance in the workplace is the extent to which people have clarity, to the extent to which they know what good looks like. Think of this as people walking into the workplace in the morning with a really clear understanding of what it will look like to go home that night knowing they've done a good job. Because if they do certain things and they act in certain ways, that will be good. And if they don't do those things, that won't be so good. The more clear people are about that, the better they tend to perform. Now, a word of warning for leaders out there listening to this. Over 95% of people are less clear than their managers think they are. There's more ambiguity, more grey areas around expectations, around standards, around values than leaders tend to think there is. Over 95%. There's a significant probability that your people are included in that 95%. The second thing that determines performance, or the second bookend, is regular feedback. And again, I've got to give you a word of warning here. More than 90% of team members say they don't get the feedback they need. Some of them don't want more feedback, but they need more feedback. Think of feedback as the information that tells them when they're walking back out of the workplace in the evening, did I hit those targets? Did I meet the expectations that were made clear to me at that clarity phase? My tip for every leader watching this is if you think you're doing enough of those things, do a bit more, because 95% of the time, team members are not getting as much as they need. Now, assuming that we've got the bookends in place, what sits between them is really down to accountability. There's lots of strategies and behaviours you can use as a leader, but they come down to accountability. In reality, accountability, feedback are versions of the same thing, but the process of accountability is all about making sure people not only understand the standards, but recognise that they need to adhere to them. Too often in workplaces, we have so many standards and we actually don't mean any of them. So we tell people one thing, but we actually observe different behaviours and nothing changes. So I'm going to talk to you about 4 critical pillars in this webinar that will help make sure accountability doesn't come as a surprise when it sits between those bookends, and that helps you retain the best people while also making it uncomfortable for people who aren't performing to continue performing at that low level. So let's get into the 4 pillars. People object to accountability when it's seen as unfair or unexpected, unreasonable, inconsistent, when it's a surprise to them, when they have been working away feeling like they were doing a good job, and then all of a sudden someone gives them information that contradicts that. Or when there's not been any accountability and all of a sudden it piles on because a manager has a sudden change of heart or an epiphany and says we need to be more accountable, and bam, here it is. So the 4 things you can do to help prevent that resistance. First of all, it's got to be clear. So you've got to spend a lot of time thinking about what you want to hold people accountable to. Now, don't shut off the webinar now and say, I thought I was only in for 20 minutes and now Simon's telling me I've got to spend a lot of time. I don't mean hours and hours and hours. I mean you've got to sit down and think about exactly what do we expect of our people. And then you've got to be able to communicate that to them. And those things have got to be 100% clear, because if there's ambiguity, then people get confused and people get resentful. One of the things that we often see in organisations is they define those expectations too narrowly. So they define really clear KPIs around performance standards, around the technical task, but they don't do enough to define the behavioural standards, the interpersonal stuff, the cultural stuff. And as a result, we have high technical performance in a team that's quite dysfunctional. We have to have both. The opposite doesn't work either. If we have really good standards, values around behaviour, but we don't have clear enough standards around performance, then we tend to drift towards a very nice team that doesn't get enough done. The biggest reason that your standards, whether behavioural or technical, may be confusing to people is the difference between what's articulated and what's implied. The difference between what we say and what people actually observe happening and what they observe our leaders and our colleagues actually doing. There's a wonderful saying that what you do speaks so loudly that I cannot hear what you say. If that's people's experience in your workplace, they will always default to what they see. That feels much more real than what's said. I'll give you an example. You could, in all of your documentation, say that we work to the highest standards. We settle for nothing but excellence. You can say that in board meetings. You can say that in leadership and team meetings. You can put it in your induction documents. You can write it into the code of conduct and the employee handbook. You can even put something around that into your workplace values. But if people observe around them their colleagues delivering mediocrity and no accountability around that, then the real message is we're okay with mediocrity. It does not matter what you say. It has to be backed up by what you do. So by all means, go ahead and say the right things. But, and this is where it gets uncomfortable, we have to be prepared to hold people accountable when those standards aren't met. I'll give you a second example. If we say in our values that respect is one of our values, everyone should be treated with respect, or however you want to phrase it, but then team members don't treat each other with respect and nothing happens, and managers are okay with that, potentially because it's one of the people that is a bit prickly to deal with, or they've been there a long time, or because we can't afford to lose them, or worse still, because it's a manager who's not demonstrating that standard, then people lose all respect for the values themselves, for the standards themselves. They assume they're a token. They believe things apply differently depending upon who you are, and they regress to the old behaviours. So we have to back up what we say with what we do. Now, before we get into the next couple of pillars, let me talk to you briefly about some resources that will support you. The vast majority of what I'm about to talk to you about are free resources that reinforce the messages we're talking about. So our podcast, once a month we record a podcast that's on the topic of leadership, team culture, teamwork, etc. Lots of tips for leaders, and we try and make them a bit of fun. We have a blog, and there's an historical bank of material there. You could search for the answers to questions you've got, and there's a very high likelihood they already sit there. We've also got some downloadable resources, and I'll let you explore that page, but again, they're all free. And the only paid resource I'm going to show you right now, we have an online leadership program, a 6-month program with online workshops, some other resources, some other things, including some individual coaching, and that's available online. You can see the link there. And if you use that discount code, you'll save $500 on a registration. Back to the pillars. So the third principle I really want to talk to you about is have less rules. Don't have rules around everything and then don't uphold any of them. So many organisations try to over-define what they expect of their people. They have rules for everything. They have rules for technical performance. They have rules for compliance. They have rules for interpersonal conduct. But then they ignore it when people actually don't observe those rules, or they ignore some of them. I very strongly believe that you should examine your rules and eliminate any that A, don't serve a real purpose, B, treat people like children. If we want them to act like adults, we've got to treat them like adults, and C, that we're not committed to upholding, that we're not prepared to undergo the pain of accountability. And holding people accountable can be painful. But if you don't have an intention to uphold that rule, then get rid of it, because it's just white noise that distracts people from the real standards. So I mentioned treating people like an adult. Rules are for technical performance and for compliance, and you may well be in an industry where those things are really important and absolutely need to be defined by rules, safety standards, industry standards, etc. Interpersonal conduct cannot be effectively defined by rules. Every time you create a rule around interpersonal conduct, there will be an exception, and you'll just end up with rules stacked on top of rules, stacked on top of rules. You're much better to have principles that guide interpersonal behaviour and rules that guide compliance, industry standards, etc. Yes, that sets up some adult discussions because principles are open to interpretation because they're not as black and white, but they're more all-encompassing. They guide people in making the right choice. They're a tool that leaders can use, managers can use to coach people when they're outside of those principles. So they do involve some discussions, and that's where the feedback and accountability sits, and we can't shy away from that. If we have an aversion to being uncomfortable, if we have an aversion to awkward, we're going to have a lot of rules and we're not going to mean any of them, and we're going to let it go when people don't comply with them. In many organisations, I've actually seen that become dangerous because in the white noise of so many rules, they're actually not upholding the ones that are vital for people's safety and for the safety of the people working with the organisation and who depend upon the organisation. A really good way to think about principles is to give people freedom within boundaries. I'm not going to say, do whatever you want. I'm going to say, these are the boundaries. These are the parameters. We need to achieve X, Y, and Z, and we need to do it within these couple of parameters. Outside of that, go for your life. You work out the best way to do it. Sometimes that will be successful, sometimes it won't. As a leader, when it's successful, I'm going to coach them and I'm going to celebrate the success. As a leader, when it fails, I'm going to coach them. And it's not about catching them doing things wrong. It's not about punishment or consequences for making mistakes. It's about coaching them to learn from those mistakes and do things better. Accountability can be a very positive process. It doesn't have to be confrontational. And what makes it confrontational is where we have a climate in which people have a fear of making mistakes because of consequence, instead of having a learning environment where people learn from their mistakes with the coaching and support of their leaders. The other thing that makes it confrontational is when we save things up, when we observe issues with a team member and we hold on to them. We write a list down, we save it for their performance review, and all of a sudden we hit them with this pile of stuff. The best time for accountability to occur is in the moment, because when it happens in the moment, it's immediate, it's connected to the event that required that accountability, and it's micro. It's about one issue rather than 10 issues that have accumulated. Now, I get it. You can't always have accountability right there in the moment because you might need to wait for the appropriate time. But that appropriate time is not next week, it's not next month, it's not at the performance review. It's as close to the event that required the accountability as possible. What we need to do is make accountability and we need to make feedback frequent and conversational. It has to be just part of what we do around here. A little test for you. If when someone gets feedback, it creates that awkwardness, if it's a moment, if it seems like it's overwhelming, then you're not giving feedback often enough. If you're able to walk up next to one of the team and see something they did really well and say, hey, that worked really well, that's a really good approach, or see something that didn't work well or something they didn't do the way you'd like them to do it, and you're equally able to say, hey, I saw the way you tackled that, what about this? Or, look, I heard the conversation you had with that team member. I don't think it quite landed right. Let's unpack that together. If you're able to do that version, then you're moving towards accountability and feedback that's frequent and conversational. Think in terms of micro feedback. So feedback that happens in small doses related to the event that required it, and that's conversational. That's a normal transaction between a manager and a team member around performing as well as we can. And that means reinforcing things that go well and debriefing and learning from things that don't, whether they're task or interpersonal. The reality about losing team members. So we started this whole thing by talking about how to give feedback, how to hold people accountable when you can't afford to lose them. The reality about losing team members is that you're going to. There is no escaping that. We live in a world where tenure is shorter than it's ever been before, where people have different expectations about growth and progression in their workplace, where people are more transient than they used to be. We're going to lose people. What you have some control and a lot of influence over is who you lose. There is no doubt in your team you've got people that you would hate to lose and people that you could afford to lose and go, oh, well, we can replace them. We work on a matrix of regrettable and preventable. And what we always work towards is not having regrettable, preventable losses. So if they're regrettable and preventable, it's someone we didn't want to lose and we should have prevented. They left because the climate wasn't what they wanted, because they didn't get the leadership they needed, because they weren't able to perform at the level they would like to because of other restrictions like the team they work in. Don't kid yourself too much on the preventable either. Sometimes someone leaves for a higher paying job, but the question is, why were they looking around? Sometimes they leave because their partner wants to move somewhere else for a job. And that can happen. But the question is, why was the partner's job the preference over them staying in their current job? And is that because they weren't particularly satisfied? It may not have been preventable. It might have been, yeah, okay, let's move for that. But it may be, yeah, I don't love my job and I'm probably going to look around anyway. So let's do that and I'll look around wherever we land. So don't kid yourself on what is preventable and what's not. There's a really high correlation between accountability, appropriate accountability, and workplace culture. And there's a huge correlation between workplace culture and keeping people and retaining people, and specifically who you retain. The reality is that culture rejects outliers. So people who are different to the way we do things around here, who don't fit with that, tend to move on. When we've got a poor culture, our best people are our outliers, and they become frustrated. And they say, I can't do my best work here because standards are really low and it doesn't matter what I do. No one else tries that hard and my team's not great to work with. And those people have choices. When we have a strong culture, our poorest performers are our outliers and they have a choice to move up or move out. And I know we're about at the 20 minutes. So I want to finish with this. As your culture improves, poor performers have a choice. And it improves through the bookends, through clarity, through feedback, and through the accountability that sits in the middle. As your culture improves, those poor performers have a choice to move up to fit in or move out because they won't fit in. The reality is there's not that many remarkably good or remarkably bad people out there. There's just people responding to the culture and leadership they're exposed to. You know this is true because you've been a remarkably good team member in some of your workplaces and probably not as good in other workplaces where you just felt uninspired by the workplace, by the people you worked with, by potentially your leader. Challenge. Are you creating a workplace and a culture that inspires people to bring their best self to work? When you look at people and think, I can't afford to hold them accountable because I can't afford to lose them, ask yourself this question. Can I afford to keep them? What's the cost? Are they creating frustration for our best people? Are they compromising results? The reality is, if you've got a mediocre person and you lose them, you've only got to find a mediocre person to replace them, which is not that hard. If you lose a great person, a good person, you've got to find a great or good person to replace them, which is much harder. Take the risk of holding people accountable and potentially losing people who don't want to work at the standard that you want them to or you need from them, because if you lose them, you can replace them with someone else. And if that someone else doesn't necessarily have the skill level you're looking for yet, but has a good attitude, they'll soon be a great person, as long as you expose them to the right workplace culture. I'm going to conclude there with here's how you can contact us. If you've got questions about this content, we're really happy to have a chat. There's no charge for that. Give us a call, send us an email, we'll have a chat and see if we can give you a few tips. Finally, I'd love for you to send us a review. Scan that code, pop in whatever stars you think we deserve, and really critically, if you could just write a really short sentence, a couple of words, that carries so much weight for people deciding whether these are worth watching, and that helps us create more content. All the best until the next Plenty in 20, and in the meantime, stay authentic.